This happened a couple of weeks ago. I keep trying to push it out of my mind, but I can't stop thinking about it. I work a full-time job, but 2 days a week I pick up hours at a small neighborhood specialty pet shop. It's owned by a friend of a friend. It's part me doing her a favor so she can have some time off, and part her helping me have some extra pocket money to help afford my many hobbies. It's a very small store. The front is comprised entirely of windows that grant you a full view of the entire space. Only one person can really work there at a time without it seeming crowded. It was my night to work, and up until then, it had been relatively quiet. I moved some stock up from the basement, priced some items, and got a chance to say hello to some of the regulars. Nothing crazy. At around 5 p.m., 2 hours before close, a crowd of friends come into the store, looking for supplies for a new kitten they had just adopted. I shared their excitement, made a few recommendations, looked at pictures of the new little bean, and eventually closed a total sale of around $200 worth of merchandise. Not bad. I bagged all of their stuff, and all but one of them left. He said he would catch up with his friends later. He just had a couple of questions for me. Up until that point, I assumed he had just been shy, or maybe he was a boyfriend that got drug out of the house or something. I mean, he had just been hanging out at the back of the crowd, not saying anything, not laughing or participating or anything. I sort of brushed it off and asked what kind of pet he had, ready to dive into the sale. He said he had a pit bull and was worried that he wasn't gaining weight quickly enough and wanted advice for what he should be doing and if it was normal. So I asked all of the relevant questions: age of the dog, sex, approximate weight, if he knew the bloodline, etc. Most dog owners that come in are extremely proud of their dogs and can literally tell you anything about them. They'll brag about their dogs endlessly, but this guy didn't seem to know anything about his dog, or even dogs in general. He didn't know what I meant by a lot of the questions. I found it really odd, but I didn't want to worry myself about it, and I did my best. I have a pit at home that had an issue with weight when my partner and I first got her, and I know how alarming it can be. Since this was a subject that I knew my stuff in even more than most others, I really did want to help him out. But the thing is, he seemed to insist on standing very close to me. No matter how many times I stepped away or distanced myself, he found a reason to get right back up against me. At one point, he stepped behind me to reach over my head and get something, even though there was plenty of space for him to grab it from where he was next to me. I was uncomfortable, but I pushed it away. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. I'm a small person, around 5'1", 110 pounds, and it's easy for me to feel a little uneasy. Even in writing this, I'm still wondering if I'm overreacting. I noticed that every time I tried to conclude the conversation with a solution, he would bring up something else and would refuse to settle for my answer on a product, thinking that maybe he was just being overly cautious about what the right solution would be. I shared with him the story of my pup and showed him some pictures of her. One inside my apartment, another at a community garden close by my apartment, just all over the place. He then pointed at a couple of the pictures and zeroed in on the landmarks, calling them out. He asked how many times a day I walk my dog. Since I had mentioned how proper exercise is important when building the muscle in the pups, I didn't think anything of letting him know I walk my dogs twice a day. I told him I try to space it out so that it's once in the morning and once in the evening, and went into how that may be a good way for him to time his feedings. Every question, I kept trying to lead him back to talking about his dog, but he wasn't interested. He noticed the plural. He asked me about my other dog. I told him the breed and age. His questions became rapid fire. Do I take care of them myself? What time do I walk them exactly? What are their names? That's when I realized I was essentially showing him our walking route. Quickly, I closed the pictures and put my phone in my pocket. I asked him to see a picture of his dog, half changing the subject, half at this point trying to confirm that he did have a dog and that he was actually looking for help. He hesitated at first, then pulled out his phone. He mumbled out a few things while he scrolled and searched. It took a few minutes, and this was the first time he stepped a few feet away from me since his friends left. He mentioned the landmarks again, saying that must be where I live, and mentioning that I wasn't that far. I stayed silent. Eventually, he pulls up a picture of a huge dog that looked nothing like what he had described, hanging out with people that weren't even him. He claimed that was the only picture he had, since he hadn't had the dog for long, and asked again if I lived where the pictures were taken. At this point, I'm definitely alarmed, but I tried to keep my cool. Freaked out and trying to hide it, I confirmed that yes, the most expensive products that I had were the ones that would do the job. I tried to assert that where I lived wasn't important, and frantically just began ringing stuff up. That was the best thing I could think of to end the encounter. I needed him to leave, and I needed to know he was gone. I rang up our biggest jug of liquid gold, our biggest bag of our bougiest and most expensive dog food, a training book, all kinds of stuff. I told him the damage, hoping he would either buy the things and leave, or tell me the usual, "I'll be back Friday," that I get after people see especially high totals. No cigar. He took a look at the total, nodded, and asked to know when I worked there, so he could work with me in the future. I told him it varied, and that he should just take me up on my recommendations now just in case, and repeated his total. He ignored that and asked to use the bathroom, pointing at the open door to the bathroom that we keep public. Not wanting to upset someone so much larger than me, with so little concern for boundaries, I told him that he could. The second the door closed, I texted the friend that connected me with the boss. She lives in one of the apartments above the shop. Luckily, she was home and she came right down. When he came out, he seemed a little disappointed that we were no longer alone, and resumed the behavior that he had originally displayed. I told him his total again, asking him how he'd like to pay. His exact reply was,
No thanks. I'm sure I'll see you around.
The way he said it still sends a chill down my spine. When I was much younger, and even still to this day, I loved camping. We lived away from the woods, however, and Dad couldn't always take us because work often got in the way. But I was determined and set my mind to camping, even if it was just in my backyard. My sister reluctantly joined me, as was the norm when we were kids. She's older than me, so often had little interest in what I wanted to do. But as the youngest, I usually got my way regardless. We went out and set up the tent with my dad's help and got some sleeping bags. I was ecstatic, even though it was just the same backyard I rolled around in all day, shooting at imaginary monsters. Little did I know how my camping trip would end. We settled in for the night, and Dad told us scary stories until he finally got tired and went in the house. My sister and I talked for a bit, and then, like the end of a heavy metal song, there was an abrupt silence as we fell asleep. I woke up to a sound, not loud, but subtle. I rolled and looked toward it and saw something small was against the tent. A bug, perhaps, but then a voice and more small things against the tent. I soon realized that they were fingers tracing a random pattern as a man spoke to someone. He spoke low and quiet. I could barely make out his words. Paralyzed with fear, I watched his finger trace the wall of the tent. Whether or not he knew we were in there, I had no idea, I looked to my sister and she was still asleep. I grabbed her hand. She awoke and looked at me and started to move. I quickly move a finger to my lips and stop her, then point to the tent. Her eyes widen and we both sit there waiting for him to make a move. Minutes go by, though they felt like hours, and eventually we hear nothing and see nothing. My sister waits a little longer and then slowly opens one of the windows. She looks and sees nothing. We open the door and run to the house and get inside and lock the door. My sister gets my dad and he investigates, but finds nothing. That was the first and last time that I ever camped in the backyard. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. Part of my duties as a COA, City of Albuquerque, patrol officer was to check the solid waste sites around the city. At the time, Montesa Park collection site in the South Valley area had activated, so I had been dispatched there to investigate. Montesa Park is isolated from residential areas, and the mostly barren hills surrounding it are covered in brush, with deep ditches, called arroyos, created by the runoff from rainwater on them. The entrance gate is doubled with a heavy chain and padlock. The site itself has a murky pond to the right of the entrance and a deep arroyo to the left, making it only accessible to vehicle traffic in the front and back. I saw the blue alarm light flashing and heard the audible alarm as soon as I reached the site. I used my searchlight to scan the area, but saw no movement or any figures that would indicate that someone had entered the site. The lock and chain were also both intact. I got out of my patrol vehicle, leaving the searchlight shining inside the site to blind anyone looking to see what I was doing. I opened the gate so I could drive my vehicle inside, and then resecured the gate behind me. I drove around slowly around the inside, checking the fence for a possible break-in, and finding no damage, I returned to the administrative office to make sure it was secure. Finding no signs of damage or forced entry, I entered the building and radioed dispatch that I had cleared the site and was resetting the alarm. I exited the building and was about to get back in my vehicle when I heard a huge crash on the other side of the site. The crash was so loud, it sounded like someone had crashed a car into the fence. The entire fence line on that side was waving like that's what had happened. I got back in my vehicle and radioed dispatch that I may have had a vehicle crash into the site's fence. I requested another officer to back me up, and I turned off my lights. I cruised slowly and quietly until I reached the area where I had heard the crash. The chain link fence was still ringing a bit when I got close. When I was close enough, I switched on my high beams to surprise anyone that might have been there. There was no vehicle or anything that might have hit the fence so hard to make it shake the way it did. What I did see was a pair of yellow eyes reflected back at me from the arroyo I had mentioned earlier on the left side of my sight. It might have been a coyote, but these eyes were big. The form I saw in the dark was big. Not coyote-sized, but the size of a defensive lineman football player. It wasn't a man, as people's eyes don't reflect yellow. And another thing, a coyote probably would have turned and ran away. This being crouched down like it was actually trying to hide itself from sight, looking right at me the entire time. It took me a moment to decide how I was going to deal with the situation, so I got on the PA and said, "Whoever is down there, don't move. Remain where you are until I make contact with you." Which is what I planned to do when backup arrived. I heard this creature grunt, and then it jumped straight up out of the arroyo and took off running, but it didn't run like a four-legged animal. It was more of a running gorilla, legs thrusting it forward more like a frog hops, and it's using its arms to run. I only told the other officer and put it in my report that I had seen someone but they ran off. Ever since then, I did check all the grounds around the site before I ever left my vehicle. And when I unlocked the gate, I was always looking over my shoulder. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired, and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple years, and even though we didn't need the money, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came there and helped them out with the stocking of the coolers or running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This all took place in the late 80s and early 90s. The actual story I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I had just gotten my learner's permit, and my dad would let me drive him to and from work just to get some experience on the road. I was sitting in my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows, book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register or stock the cooler at different times. I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that was unusual, and I realized that a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on I-75. This in itself was really strange, because where we were located, you didn't get many people walking, and definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured she had broken down somewhere, and was coming to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something. I was completely wrong. She came into the store, looked around for a few minutes, and I remember getting just a strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town north from us. Ocala was the town. This is important. My dad lets her know that he's working and there's no way that he could take her. She turns and looks at me. And while she is looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head, no. I was confused for a second, but then she turns back to my dad and points at me, asking if I can take her. My dad responded that I only had my learner's permit and wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Normally, I would have done it, even though it's illegal, because I had done it a few times already. I didn't argue with my dad, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason, he was almost curt and dismissive of her. Turns out he had a bad vibe about her from the minute that he had seen her walking up the drive. Well, she cusses him for a few minutes, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She swings the door open. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she opened it, and then she stalks out of the store and down the driveway. I keep an eye on her and continue to watch as she makes her way back up to the interstate and then starts up the northbound on-ramp. Almost a year passes, and I'm in my bedroom, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here and look at this." I quickly run to the living room and see my dad pointing at the TV and look at the mugshot of a lady up on the screen and immediately remember her as the lady who had been in the store. Turns out, I had almost given a ride to Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and then later put to death. And I still have nightmares about what could have happened.